Should new President Donald Trump pardon the January 6th protesters? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled, uncompromising case for the free society. And I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you.
All right, Richard. So this week is the 4-year anniversary of the January 6th protests, or as the official narrative says, the insurrection. And you've got Donald Trump coming into office soon, and he is almost certain to be issuing mass pardons of every single protester or insurrectionist that was participating in those, or at the very least, all those that didn't initiate some kind of force against a Capitol police officer or someone else. It's not real clear what he's going to do about those, but there's no question but that he's going to upend this whole scheme of 4 years of criminal prosecutions, sometimes very high jail sentences, hundreds of prosecutions. I mean, the feds did everything they could to figure out every single person that was involved in those. And I don't know if they've been able to do that 100%, but they've gotten pretty close, studying the videos, talking to people, and targeting people all across the country and having them indicted there in DC and bringing them over for trial and conviction and sentencing. Very, very high conviction rate. So as we look at this thing, I think it's important to analyze it because we've been subjected to this official narrative, and I've just never bought this narrative. And the narrative is that these were people who were trying to overthrow the government, and these sentences where the judges are sentencing them to, they pontificate, and what a terrible thing that you were trying to overthrow the government violently, and then slap them with a great big jail sentence. Well, that's got to be one of the most ludicrous narratives, in my opinion, that I've ever come across to justify any type of official action. For one thing, not one of these people had a gun. Now, they say, well, some of them were armed because they had a pocket knife in their pocket or something ridiculous like that. But everybody in this country knows about AR-15s and about assault rifles in general. Everybody knows that you can go out and buy these things. They're legal. And how are you going to violently overthrow the most powerful government in the world without a gun? I mean, even just that alone shows you how ridiculous this insurrectionist take over the government narrative was. The notion that, I mean, this would have been the first time in history that people violently overthrew a government over the opposition of the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, the Capitol Police, the Washington, D.C. Police, the National Guard, and everybody else that would have been mobilized to smash these 100 people or so, or whatever the number was. I mean, it's totally ridiculous. We all know that okay, there was a protest there, demonstration outside the Capitol. We all know that they trespassed illegally, entering onto the Capitol property. They weren't supposed to do that. They broke through doors, and they bashed through the guards and trespassed onto property that they shouldn't have been. But we all know that that's what happens sometimes with protests. They get out of hand. People's emotions start governing them, taking control. There's that sort of the mob mentality where you get courage because everybody else is doing something. But the notion that these people were going to take over the federal government is so ludicrous. Now, I have no doubts that Donald Trump was hoping that this would happen, that they would figure out some way to keep him in power. I had no questions about that. I thought it was disgraceful the way he sat back for 2 or 3 hours waiting to see how things were developed, because I think he was hoping that they would figure out some way to keep him in power through that certification process and so forth. But the fact is that these were loyal followers of Trump who got out of hand and were essentially just protesting. A protest, they got out of hand. Now, one of the funny aspects of this thing is how the defenders always refer to this thing as having caused 10 deaths. And they're very careful about how they phrase that this insurrection brought about 10 deaths. What it is very deceptive, because what they don't tell you is that those 10 deaths, really 9 of them were just from like natural causes. People had heart attacks. Among the protesters, they had heart attacks. Among the guards, they had heart attacks. I think those numbers even include suicides by some of the guards later on. But there was only one real killing in this thing. That's why they always say they resulted in deaths, not in killings, but in deaths. But because there was only one real killing, and that was the killing of Ashley Babbitt, one of the protesters. I mean, this woman was unarmed. She was trying to get through a broken window, and a Capitol policeman just shot her dead. She was not threatening any force against him. She certainly not deadly force, which is the standard by which one uses to determine whether the use of deadly force was justified or not. He used deadly force. He just shot her. She didn't have a gun in her hand. She had no weapon in her hand. And he goes scot-free. The Justice Department says, oh, he was justified in doing this because he was protecting the Capitol. Pure nonsense. The use of deadly force, the standard for the use of deadly force does not change just because it's the Capitol he's defending. The same rules apply. And that's the guy who should not be pardoned. And of course, Trump's not going to pardon him, but Biden might. And Biden has no business pardoning him. That guy deserves to be indicted for the wrongful killing of Ashley Babbitt. So those are my perspectives on this whole January 6th nonsense. What are your perspectives, Richard?
Well, let me start off sort of in a way that you did as well. I considered Donald Trump's behavior that day, 4 years ago, to be disgraceful. There are standards of what is a legal responsibility for causing violence or initiating violence or inducing violence, of which you as the lawyer know the technicalities of which I don't. But it's clear to me that whether or not Donald Trump had any legal responsibility for the events that day, he acted in a totally irresponsible way with his insistence that he had not lost the election, with his rousing of the demonstrators who were rallying at that meeting with him that day, on a use of a rhetoric that was, and I'm using this in a non-legal sense because as the layman, inflammatory rhetoric. Oh, I've been treated unjustly. Oh, the election was stolen. Oh, something should be done to correct this wrong. And they go off and do this. So, and again, as you say, he waited hours to make any public statement telling those followers of his to just go home when he could have. So I believe that he acted irresponsibly. I would even argue with a small e, unethically, in how he attempted to influence people's thinkings, regardless again of by the technicalities of the law, whether he had any legal responsibility or not for the events that occurred. But I totally agree with you. The fact is that these people went to the Capitol building unarmed. And I'm glad you emphasized that, is that they're, to my knowledge, I don't recall reading at the time or after any claim or accusation or proof that any of these people were armed with what would be considered weapons, usually connected with an insurrection, a violent attempt to overthrow a government. A pocket knife, no matter how much we've seen these instances of mass stabbings of people in certain places in the world over the last several years. A pocket knife is not going to overthrow the United States government because, as you rightly point out, if you count all the branches of the U.S. Armed Forces, the National Guard, the armed federal policing personnel in Washington, D.C., there's no way that a bunch of people shouting and holding a stick or a piece of furniture that they've broken through their unauthorized trespassing on Capitol property are going to overthrow the government. And if you watch this on television live or all the showings of it afterwards, they're happy people. They're I have Nancy Pelosi's podium. And, oh, look, I'm sitting in the speaker's chair. I mean, it was like an irresponsible festivity, a love fest, an irresponsible trespassing love fest. Now, I'm sure that those who take the other side don't want to think of it in those words, but that's what it basically was. And the Grievous Act, and again, I'm just highlighting and emphasizing what you said, was the shooting of that poor woman. She was unarmed. She was attempting to go through a window, and this Capitol armed guard just pulled out his gun and shot her dead in a way that I consider, as you're saying, certainly legally, but just as a human being, totally unjustified. If you think that she's breaking in property, but she's unarmed, well, attempt to subdue her in some less lethal fashion. Put handcuffs on her, grab her, pull her down, and put handcuffs on her. But the shooting of her like this, I mean, that's the horrendous individual violent act of that day. But what's important is that why do the Democrats and the progressives insist upon this? And in saying the following things, I want to emphasize, anyone who has followed my writings during the 4 years that Donald Trump was president, writings that I wrote for the Future Freedom Foundation on its website, or in the monthly Future Freedom publication, or in other articles that I was writing on an almost weekly basis at that time, know that I unflinchingly, constantly criticized Donald Trump for his misguided, irresponsible, and economically wrong-headed economic policies, as well as his arrogance and hubris of thinking that he could say anything, do anything, believing that he could use executive authorities in a random way to try to, quote, make America great again as he conceives it. So I have no attempt to in any way whitewash his 4 years of presidency or the stupid policies that are likely to follow over the next 4 years. But having said that, as a caveat, the fact is, why does the left, why do the progressives, why does the Democratic Party insist upon this narrative? Because it fits in with their ideology, that all those who are not social democrats, and that's, always remember, that is a shorthand for democratic socialists. And whether you want to call socialism with a big S, a little s, direct government ownership, or the fascist version of where the government manipulates, controls, and directs and prods people to use their private property in the way the political authorities want, the fact is that they have a narrative, and they are insistent that all those that they define as on the right, which includes everyone from being right of center moderate to conservative to certainly classical liberal and libertarian, they define as crypto-fascists. Anyone who doesn't share their ideology, their vision of a true progressive democratic society, are those who want to stand in the way of progress, attempting to be on the wrong side of history, to slow down the happy golden Wizard of Oz path to socialism and paternalism and the caring of all by the state. Everyone who opposes that is an enemy of true freedom, and therefore is defined by them since the 1930s as a fascist, as someone who's against the will of the people, the democratic spirit, who wants to impose their whims and wishes and dictatorial demands upon others. And if you're a classical liberal and libertarian, what does that mean? Yeah, the majority can't infringe on the rightful and peaceful rights of individuals, your life, your liberty, your honestly acquired private property, your free and voluntary associations and exchanges with others. And the government is there to secure liberty and not to violate it. Oh, how shocking, how fascist to actually say government should be limited. Oh my God, what'll be next? But they've had this narrative that anyone who opposes their ideology and policies is by definition a fascist. So they have to say that anyone who challenged them, who didn't want to see them elected, who opposed the politics that they wanted to implement, and Biden has attempted to implement in his own senile ways over the last 4 years, is somehow the enemy of all that is good, and therefore is by definition another Mussolini or Hitler. And they've even called Trump a Hitler. So, and his followers as fascists. So they have to have this narrative that this was an attempt to overthrow the U.S. government, to thwart the will of the people, the true progressive democratic majority, to justify and rationalize that there is no legitimate point of view other than their own. And therefore you tar and feather everyone who does not share that. Now, I'll just add one thing. This is not a new thing. Back last January of 2024, I did an article for Future Freedom publication on the FDR's bogus economic bill of rights, since it was the I guess the 70th anniversary, 80th, I guess a 70th anniversary of 80th anniversary since he did that on his State of the Union address back then in 1944. But the point is that he made a point of arguing in that State of the Union address that anyone who opposed the New Deal policies and his idea that the traditional Bill of Rights was insufficient and had to have an economic Bill of Rights, which was basically interventionist welfare statism and government control of things, that they wanted to take us back to a fascist path. So anyone who opposes them is the enemy of everything that is good, true, and just. And they have to preserve that narrative. Otherwise, they have to rationally and logically defend the policies they want, rather than to tar and feather anyone who opposes them, and to use this event of January 6th, 4 years ago, as a way to say, you see, anyone who opposes us is the enemy of everything good.
Well, you make an interesting point about Nancy Pelosi's podium and other things in there. And I think that's a lot of what's going on here. You see, all those things are considered sacred. They're part of the realm of the kingdom. And it's like, going into the Sistine Chapel and, grabbing things there. And I think that's what really set them off, Richard, that these people were showing no respect for this hallowed ground within the empire, and that we have to really teach them a lesson. And we need to send a lesson to everybody that you don't ever, ever denigrate these sacred items within your realm. And your point about Ashley Babbitt is a really interesting one too, is that this guy is a guard. For one thing, he's a man, and he's therefore most likely much more physically able to subdue a woman. And this woman has no gun in her hand. All he had to do was either push her back through the window that she was trying to get through, just walk over the window and shove her back, or let her come in and manhandle her. To me, cops don't want to throw people to the ground. We know that. You throw her to the ground, as you say, handcuff her. In other words, do everything you can to preserve life. You don't use deadly force except when you're threatened with deadly force. And there's no question that he was not threatened with deadly force. And I think also what's going on here is that in the Capitol, among the guards and among the legislators, you got a bunch of scaredy cats. These people are scared of everything. I mean, you can see it with the whole thing, scared of the illegal immigrants, scared of the Iranians, scared of the Russians, scared of the Chinese, scared of the terrorists, the Muslims, Iran. I mean, there's always these boogeymen out there that they have to inculcate the American people with fear to justify all of their destruction of liberty. But they live in fear. The people within the government, they are the most powerful government in history, and yet they live in fear. Imagine they really were scared to death that these people were going to kill them with no guns, take over the government. I mean, the whole thing is just so ludicrous, this mindset. But I think that fear is what does it. The third thing I want to mention is Trump. Trump, I think, really believed that he had a shot to stay in office. And he was hoping that that January 6th thing, that certification process would inure to his benefit, where maybe Pence would get in there and say, well, I don't certify the results for Biden. I certify them for Trump. But the real kicker here, I think people forget, is the Pentagon. It's the Pentagon who decided the race here, because at some certain point in there, the Pentagon issued one of the most remarkable statements ever in the history of this country, where it essentially declared Biden to be the winner. I mean, they actually issued like a press release or an order saying didn't say we declare Biden to be the winner, but it was acknowledging Biden to be the winner and that they would be supporting Biden. And it was at that point that Trump realized his goose was cooked, that without the support of the military, he was done. And I think that's an important lesson here, in that any national security state, it's not the Supreme Court or the Congress or even the electorate that's going to make that ultimate decision. It's your national security state. We see this with Maduro. Maduro, the dictator there in Venezuela, is a classic example. He just ran for re-election, and there is virtually no doubt he lost that election big time. They got like the opponents got like 80% of the voting tallies around the country, showing that he lost by a 2-to-1 margin. And in the 20% of the ballots that he took possession of, he won't release them. He won't show the tallies. And so it's virtually clear that he lost big time, but he's got the military intelligence establishment behind him. As soon as he declared himself the winner, and his own little handpicked commission and Supreme Court declared him the winner, people were going into the streets en masse. Fine. He just orders his military intelligence establishment, the national security state, to start arresting him. I mean, he arrested around 2,200. He's got an arrest warrant out for the president who beat him, the candidate who beat him, the woman who's leader of the opposition movement. So that's the risk that you run when you've got a national security state. I think Trump was hoping that the Pentagon would side with him, and once he realized that he had lost the Capitol protests, and then he had lost the support of the Pentagon, he knew he was out.
Well, I think that your point here is important to emphasize, and that whether we're talking about, as you always emphasize, the national security, the foreign military interventionist establishment in the United States, from the State Department to the Defense Department to the Pentagon and so on. Whether you're talking about a version of it in the United States or really any country, every government ultimately has its authority, whether the population views it as legitimate or not, based upon its ability to have a sufficient monopolization of physical and lethal force to maintain itself in power. The only way a government falls in the face of an opposition is if the military either acquiesces and chooses not to take sides, and therefore delegitimizes the existing government that is being opposed because they will not defend it, or a sufficient number of the military, could be the whole military establishment of that, even a pipsqueak country, or at least a sufficient number of it that goes over to the opposition and therefore is willing to use force to delegitimize and overthrow the established regime. Unless you have that, you don't succeed. Or it becomes an end-ending bloody conflict when two military forces are vying for the same political authority, as we see in Sudan today. You have the, quote, the illegitimate dictatorial government and its military. And then you have this rapid strike force, which is basically led by a rival of the existing Sudanese president for absolute power in the country. And they just ravage the country. They've displaced millions of people. At least well over 500,000 people have died in just being caught in the crossfire, or being consciously wiped out as being viewed as supporters of the other side. But unless you have the force of the state, the military and policing authority behind you, uh, either it's actively supporting it or sufficiently threatening to call itself into effect to intimidate any opposition, uh, a government can't stand. And the fact is that, as you're saying, clearly the military would not have supported Trump or acquiesced by just remaining neutral. The National Guards would not have. There would certainly be a sufficient number of governors who would have put the National Guards at the disposal of the person who is viewed as the legitimately elected president and his administration. So that this could not have worked. It ultimately, what is the state? The state ultimately relies upon the monopolized authority to use physical force to assure the enforcement of its laws, rules, and regulations. The state is legitimized force. And as long as a state has the wherewithal to draw upon and have support of that legitimized force, it is very difficult to overthrow it. So to imagine, to go back to where we started from, that these what dozens or maybe a couple of hundred people who break in a festive mood with paint on their faces, and happily playing with Nancy Pelosi's podium is just ludicrous. And again, if I can just extend this for one more minute, because you mentioned something very interesting that at the end of your remarks, Jacob, and that was this idea of the sacredness of the Capitol building, the hallowedness of every object, as if it's a religious artifact that must be handled with care, representing a divinity, a divinity. I mean, this is not just the property, the artifacts. This is how they view these people. Jimmy Carter has died, and he reached the milestone age of 100 before his passing away. But he was a terrible president. Yes, even from a classical liberal point of view, he introduced, if you'll forgive the use of the word, Jacob, reforms that deregulated the airline industry, and he started the process of deregulating the airwaves, which has allowed this blossoming of the mass media through the internet and satellite and everything else. He was a terrible president. He was an interventionist. He was a regulator. He ran deficits. He caused inflation. He was a bumbling interventionist abroad. He ruined the years of practice and hope of the American Olympic teams because he wouldn't send them to Moscow because the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. I mean, he was a bumbling, awful president who irritated people. I remember that when there was the energy crisis, he did a television fireside chat in the tradition of FDR, and there in a rocking chair with his cardigan sweater on, he said, "We must do everything possible to conserve our energy. I feel your pain." Like they give you some pain, Jimmy, some pain. We have to turn down and conserve our energy. Don't put on those Christmas lights. Well, who am I to question the authority of the president? Conserve energy? Great. I turned off the television. I didn't have to listen to that annoying voice anymore. I feel your pain. He was a terrible president. But what happens? He dies. He's sanctified. It's like a divinity is rising to the heaven with the other gods. Oh, he was wonderful. He was good. He was caring. He put his hands to work for Habitat for Humanity. Oh, his Carter Center. Oh, I mean, he suddenly is given sainthood. He was a lousy, irritating, stupid, misguided, wrong-headed, bumbling politician who didn't deserve a second term. But no, he's now risen as demigod to Mount Olympus. I mean, the absurdity of this. He's a human being who gets up in the morning and has to take a pee like the rest of us.
Yeah, but I don't think you give enough credit though, Richard. That no, no, really. How many presidents would have had the courage to face down a killer rabbit when faced with and Carter did that. I mean, a killer rabbit came after him and he didn't run. He fought that killer rabbit. And so I think we should give him some credit at least.
Obviously, that's almost as impressive of a shirtless Vladimir Putin, out riding in the forest or wrestling with a tiger. Yes, yes, yes. Jimmy Carter stands in that Olympian god.
All right. On that note, well, I guess we're going to find out how all these pardons work out in about 2 or 3 weeks here. The Washington establishment will clearly be up in arms over what's about to happen. All those federal judges are going to be chagrined, including those that are still trying to sentence people to jail, knowing that Trump's going to come in. They're trying to get their last licks in against these protesters and at least jail them.
But there's also what about that judge in New York City who's going to issue some kind of a sentence on Trump? And he says he's going to do no jail time. But what if he went on the bench and said, "Ha, I was joking. Trump, you're going to jail for 10 days until the election."
Well,
until the inauguration.
Trump would have the right to appeal, so that would be delayed anyway. And at the worst, it would be extended out to
that is to put a felony sticker on his forehead. It's sort of like the Scarlet Letter from Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel, but he would be the embossed F, felon. This is what they want. It's just this attempt to label all opponents, even when they're stupid opponents who deserve a lot of labeling, like he does, to label all of them as enemies of the true good of mankind.
Well, that's all the lawfare that they used in the impeachment process and the Russia collusion, delusion, and all that nonsense. The question, though, is whether Trump's going to retaliate and use the same methods against his enemies that they used against him.
Oh, no, but you see, but they had good intentions.
Oh,
Trump is malicious, and that's what counts.
I see. Okay. On that insightful note, we'll wrap things up. Richard, as always, I enjoyed the conversation with you. I would say that, Richard, maybe you ought to work in the new year. One of your resolutions ought to be to express your mind more clearly, because sometimes it's not real clear where you stand on issues.
I was about to say the same thing about you. But all I can say is that, the 20th of January will be here before we know it. And let the circus games begin.
That's a good way to put it. All right. On that note, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for your great support of FFF. Richard, look forward to talking to you next week.
Till next time.